Good morning. It's 11:45 a.m. on June 11th, 2021. My name is Charity Colleen Crouse. I am the Attorney General of Texas. I was not elected to the office of the Attorney General. What happened was there was ongoing acts of sedition that occurred during an alleged declared state of emergency in the state of Texas. Incredibly unconstitutional actions were occurring that also included trafficking people through the Health and Human Services Network and was specifically and significantly engaging in frauds against the government, not only of Texas, but also the United States of America, and contriving to manipulate and rig the upcoming election in 2017. This had been going on prior to my effort to contact the Supreme Court of Texas, including first through the Supreme Court of Texas, then through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals regarding a writ of habeas corpus after I had been kidnapped. And then later through the Texas Supreme Court, specifically in regards to acts of sedition that I had identified were ongoing by the beginning of August of 2017. There was precedent under existing law in the state of Texas for addressing emergency matters, including ones that were attempting to undermine national security and undermine the state of Texas. I did what I could by law. I let the Supreme Court of Texas know. I also contacted numerous state legislatures and members of the federal legislature from Texas prior to commencing these actions. To this day, nobody has been able to successfully repudiate my claim, and on the contrary, has been engaged in a very concerted conspiracy that now, over the years, has been revealed to have gone back several years. In addition, there was substantial election interference during the 2008 election season that was first reported on a local level to the Harris County Commissioners and the Harris County Commissioners Court by February of 2018. Since that time, I'm on the record as saying that none of the elections that have occurred, at least within the state of Texas, in at least 3 cities I have been witness to personally, since I first re-arrived in Texas in 2016, has been in any way, shape, or form constitutional, and the means by which they've been intentionally interfered with have yet to be addressed in any jurisdiction or under consideration of any court of law, including the technological means by which they're accomplished that have international implications. As such, except for a short period of time, I have maintained my claim as the Attorney General of Texas. It is for that reason I'm going to go ahead and respond. I understand that there are some activities ongoing now, and I acknowledge that prior to coming to Texas in 2016, I was in Chicago for a year, or a little under a year, and that prior to 2010, I'd been in Chicago for most of the term of 14 years, with 1 year off in Texas between 2005 and 2006. It was the longest time I've ever lived in any one location in my life. I grew up in a context where I moved around a variety of times. Never spent more than 4 years in any one place until I moved to Chicago. So not only via aggregation, but also in terms of consistency, I lived in Chicago, Illinois longer than I've lived anywhere else. My understanding of citizenship or residency is not a conventional one based upon a protracted period of time in a fixed location. Because I've lived in many places within the United States in my life, I understand my relationship and my commitment to the people to be very comprehensive and to need to take into account both the local factors directly impacting people's lives, but also in a consideration that we are also within a federal compact via our relationship with our individual states, and that there are not only obligations, but there are also protections that we are accorded and we have a right to demand. Now, I'm just going to try to keep this very brief. At some point in time in my former days as a journalist, I composed an article on a variety of matters related to the real estate market in Chicago that I understand now to be very important. The truth of the matter is in my investigation, I believe there might be competing interest in identification of my contributions as a former journalist as well as newspaper editor in terms of what's considered to be an asset that somebody else might want to claim for themselves. That there are competing interests. That there was almost a predetermined claim that had been put upon my future work products without ever being disclosed to me, that somebody else anticipated they were going to be able to claim as theirs and use to their advantage. But in the course of actually performing the work I did as a journalist, it was revealed that my work had actually created things that would be considered of value to other people, including other people that would be in political opposition to that whom believed they had originally asserted or attempted to establish some sort of claim to my future work. I believe that the contestation over my actual work and the work that I did with other people and the specific manner in which I did it is something that other people felt that they had a claim to, and that they've been using their false exercise of a false claim in order to try to compel other people into conceding to a form of political brinksmanship that is completely unconstitutional and has very disastrous long-term consequences, as we have seen. If you have to call in FEMA to cover up for the implications of your fraud, I think it's safe to say we're dealing with a disaster, one way or another. I mean, you want it characterized as a disaster for insurance purposes. So just admit it. The question then becomes, who ultimately is the culpable criminal in this consideration? This article that was under my name had many people that were identified as contributors. I understand this happens to be a very important article in somebody's consideration, including consideration of political capital that they've used to get themselves to president. 3 times. 3 different people alleging that they're the president of the United States. Within that article, other people had done primary research. They composed their initial reports. I also did at least 2 different areas of real estate within the city. I believe there were 9. And then they were compiled into one article that was put under my byline, but listed each of them as a contributor. This was a very specific decision I had to make professionally in terms of determining whether to list each of them as co-authors or as sharing a byline, or to parse it out and to allow each of them to have an individual byline, so to speak, with each area. But what was decided on, not just by me, but primarily with an understanding that I approved it, so I take responsibility for it, is that after I did the work of the editing and then put it within the context of an introduction as well as a conclusion, that I had the byline. The byline was in my name, and each of them that contributed were listed as contributors at the end. Now, I understand in terms of political praxis, especially if one identifies themselves in a legacy of people who have been involved with dissemination of public information, both for the purposes of political literacy, but also as a means by which to provide the material preconditions for actual democratic engagement by groups of people when it comes to actually establishing and exercising ownership of the political capital of their own milieu and their own areas, that the actual designation of authorship when it comes to a collaborative project is very important. As a matter of fact, I've seen this transform myself, especially when it has to deal with scientific works, or also in another manner, seeing historically how that paired out, right? How it played out that if you're involved in a context where even if somebody may have a specific skill connected to the actual composition, or may have a particular skill associated with the copy editing or the proofreading, that the other kinds of contributions people made, even if they're writing it with a different style, one that may or may not pass certain standards, once you allow for that contribution to be included into your final work, the question of, well, how do you attribute them? How do you acknowledge them? How are they to be quantified or characterized in terms of the manner in which they provide it? What ends up being the final product, right? What ends up being the final presentation to the community. And historically, different political tendencies and different political groupings, not just in the United States, by the way, but around the world, have had a different understanding of what it means to have a byline, or to share a byline, or in some cases, to not even list a byline with an author, but allow for the publication, and through your association with the publication, a group of people to actually have responsibility or to be acknowledged as a part of the validity and the political capital of the publication. So when you dispossess me of the actual fruits of my labor in these regards, what you're also doing is you're dispossessing a group of people that were involved in very important decisions about attribution, ownership, and responsibility for being a part of a very important moment in the political history, not only of Chicago, but also the country, and by virtue of how it was represented and the priorities around the actual publication, people around the world. As a matter of fact, while I was managing editor, I had the privilege of meeting with people who had actually been editors of publications in other countries. The newspaper itself was in an international confederation of street newspapers. I personally never traveled to those conferences because I was doing the work locally during the time frame when those events occurred. This is something that is a role that I've usually played. There's an event, or there is something that is important for the community, so representatives are sent to participate in that event, while I locally engage in the regular day-to-day work to make sure that the work we're representing ends up being consistent and ends up going out on time and has the quality that people expect. And so when the other people would travel to these conferences, I did not attend. But that does not mean that I did not acknowledge and understand the responsibility and the role we had within an international compact and an international organization of street newspapers, including street newspapers that primarily served or understood their explicit goal was to focus on issues connected to poverty and homelessness as a way to provide a means by which people could be extricated and move on and beyond poverty and homelessness. And so how you consider contributions from people that are creating in the course of trying to educate or in the course of trying to find actual practical information that can then be compiled and put into effect in order to change the material conditions is very important. So when you refuse to allow me to have access to that article, what you're also saying is everybody else that was a contributor and is had to deal necessarily with the implications of understanding that they were contributors to something that was that important is also dispossessed. If there was a need, for instance, to hold somebody accountable because it was understood that perhaps they had too much credit comparable to their actual contributions, well, that needs to be addressed directly. If, on the other hand, there's an understanding that by virtue of their ascribement in that particular context and the fact that I had the byline personally, I was the one who assumed the risk. And because I was the one who assumed the risk, if a risk comes up associated with their contributions, then they could put it on me because I have the byline. But please understand, I didn't just have the byline. I was also the managing editor, and that's completely appropriate. So when you refuse to acknowledge my contributions in this regard, what you also refuse to do is acknowledge your contributions at the level you think you're at, where you're in a management position, where you're responsible for the welfare of other people, and you intend and follow through on positioning yourself in manners that undermine the welfare and safety of other people while compromising the welfare and safety of your own. So we've got a very profound sort of situation that has been allowed to play out for the last going on 20 years. I left that publication prior to, right after September 11th in order to engage in international travel and to provide other kinds of representation, not only of the political issues at hand, but also in different manners. I no longer was a managing editor at a publication, but I did write, I did publish, I did do public speaking. I did maintain networks. I was a part of boards of directors of organizations that had a political praxis about them. And so when you try to say that whatever it was that your qualms were, or whatever it was that your concerns were with the content or whatever was published, including if you have concerns about the veracity of the actual content, or including if there was a prescience, and I use the word prescient deliberately and specifically, at 1352 into this recording, that one of the reasons why it's important, right at the right time. Just a second. So did you hear that? Every single one of those chimes is a notification of an anniversary of a report that I made to an official agency. Now, after being a journalist, you might ask, well, why are you sending all of these reports to, well, all the agencies, for instance, I sent those reports to? It's a good question, right? Why did none of those agencies respond? And in some cases, going on 4 years. Tomorrow will be 3 years on some of them. 3 years is a very important timeline, isn't it? So is 20. So the point I'm making, to return to what I was saying about the prescience, if there was something in the articles that were written at the time that may have had at one period of time concern in terms of contestation around its depiction of fact, then the question becomes, well, how long do you hold on to that information before you literally confront whatever your concern is? Because what I've seen is, in my own self-reflection, and what would have been a necessary standard to apply as a professional, not only for myself, but also for people I would be working with, that over time, an understanding of what could potentially have been considered mitigating factors at the time allows for another perspective of seeing what could potentially be a conflict of interest, or could be an acknowledgement of having access to information that at the time was not conveyed through verifiable channels, and may or may not have been a part of an intentionally engaged disinformation campaign in order to sabotage whatever it was that was on the line at the time with that reporting. Now, this is something we're dealing with in a way now that's very different than it was back then. We did not put things on the internet. We did not have instantaneous publication. It was a weekly publication. It was in print. And if anything was put on the internet, it was just excerpts as a way to let people know what the content was going to be for that particular issue. But there's not digital media. We're not talking about digital media. But we are talking about paper media and print media, including paper media and print media that I now understand was connected to somebody else's financial strategy involving very long-term deals, some of which are 30 years, perhaps even more. And so the refusal to provide verification of things that happened 20 years ago, or things that might have been impacted 10 years after publication based upon things that were written 10 years before that, is still accruing. And there's no statute of limitations. As a person, a professional person, and as somebody with the kind of commitments I had then that has maintained them despite other things that have occurred, I now understand that it is necessary to establish accountability and a process of verification, including a chain of evidence with official reporting bodies, even if there's sabotage, even if there's infiltration, even if they did, in fact, export the Daily Machine to Washington, D.C., and then decided to implement it on a global scale. Even if that happened, it's important because in the actual pursuit of justice, we all have the possibility to step up and into that which would actually follow through on those commitments if we actually meant them to begin with. And none of the people I was working with would have willingly conspired to contrive misinformation and then disappear it, along with disappearing people that were a part of the political movement. The whole point is you confront people. The whole point is you challenge people. You could do that in the media, but you can also do it in the court of law. As a matter of fact, part of what needs confrontation now is the political legacy by virtue of ordinary political process, putting things into the media and allowing for it to be a part of our access and contributions for circulation so that then we can make informed decisions and be held accountable. But also the professional products as well as the professional milieu within which people were when they were targeted by other products created with stolen public information, stolen lives that were used to target political opposition. And part of that has to do specifically with the role of confrontation. It's a constitutional right. If you are accused, you have a right to be confronted by your accuser in a court of law. You don't have an expectation of being falsely declared to be associated with or an asset of a foreign country so they can isolate you, subject you to illegal and persecutorial interrogations as a way to try to follow through on ensuring their crime, and then say, well, we don't like your attitude, so we're not going to meet with you. See, if you're somebody that is in a situation right now where somebody is trying to extort you, or somebody is trying to tell you that you don't have a right to actually confront your accuser while you are also provided with representation and support in so doing, they're wrong. It's not legal for them to do that. They do not have a right to say it's intelligence. They do not have a right to say it's national security, because the truth of the matter is that is absolutely contrary to anything that has a legitimate justification as being identified as intelligence, or anything that has a legitimate justification as being identified as national security. So I understand that you're probably interested on in that parcel, in that particular part of town. All right, but you got to understand, it wasn't alone, it wasn't isolated. It was among others. So you can't just isolate and contain it and then try to entrap it. It's not possible. If you have a problem with the fact that I had the byline, then just so you know, as a manager, I made that decision. And if you're in a position where you're responsible for the welfare of other people, and you're willingly aiding and abetting these processes to set your own people up to cover up for your crime, then you're going to have to deal with that. You took that risk.